Hello, this is going to be a video about the lies of the moderators, Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg during the primary debates on the topic of healthcare. Now, you may recall the first two debates were split into two nights due to the number of candidates. But on the night Bernie Sanders was on, the very first question both nights was about taxes going up to pay for Medicare for all. And in the second debate, shortly after that, Warren was also asked, are you also with Bernie on Medicare for all when it comes to raising taxes on middle-class Americans to pay for it? The third debate started with Joe Biden talking about this issue, and then once again, they asked Warren whether she'd admit that she'd raise taxes to pay for Medicare for all. This also happened in the fourth debate after they first talked about Donald Trump. They then dove right into this again. I don't want to waste your time and read all the quotes, but hopefully you can agree that the question, will taxes go up to pay for Medicare for all, was an extremely popular question, let's say, from all the debates, at least those first four. I haven't watched the last couple, I confess. So, with that in mind, I'd like to explain why this is such a horrible question. Now, before I dive into that directly, I'd like to give an analogy. I don't mean to insult your intelligence, but sometimes an analogy helps shed a little extra light, maybe make you think about it a little more, especially if you might have a bias against it to begin with. So, let's get right in. Suppose two people work together, Alice and Bob, and suppose usually they both work till 5 p.m. But work's been busy, and lately Bob's been working until 7 p.m., whereas Alice still only works till 5 p.m. Now, suppose Bob started complaining about this, saying he works 2 hours later than Alice every day, and, he's frustrated about it, etc. Now, if you found out later that Alice came into work at, say, 6 a.m., and Bob comes in at, say, 10 a.m., in other words, 4 hours after Alice, meaning Alice works 2 extra hours every day, you would probably think Bob was being extremely misleading, right? Because it's not who stays later, it's who puts in the most hours, assuming they both work at the same pace, etc. Now, in this video, when I say people are lying, oftentimes I do mean they're being deceptive, misleading, talking out of context, etc., because I don't really want to play around with semantics. So if I say lie, feel free to replace that with being dishonest if you'd prefer. But in this case, I'd say Bob was lying, if he intentionally tried to make it sound like he worked longer hours. Now suppose their manager got involved, and let's say their manager's name is George Stephanopoulos, because I'm going to tie this analogy, the manager is going to be like the moderators. So suppose manager George goes and talks to Alice and says, hey, I hear you've been leaving 2 hours earlier than Bob every day. Is that true? Now Alice would reasonably respond a bit frustrated, like, well, Bob's been misleading you. I go into work 4 hours before him every day, so I don't know what he's complaining about. Now, a reasonable manager would be on your side, right, or on Alice's side. They'd think, wow, okay, Bob was trying to deceive us. But this is George Stephanopoulos, so he's either extremely dumb or dishonest. So instead, he asks Alice again, yeah, I understand you come in earlier, but do you leave 2 hours earlier? And Alice is like, well, again, I work longer hours, but yeah, I do leave 2 hours before Bob. Now, suppose further that manager George now goes to his superiors, district managers, whoever. In that case, let's suppose that's us, the audience watching the debate. And suppose manager George tells those managers, Alice has been leaving 2 hours earlier than Bob every day. I spoke to her about it, and she herself admitted as much. Now, you would think, wow, manager George is an absolutely horrible human being. He's very much misrepresenting Alice. He didn't technically lie, but again, in this case, I'd say he's a liar. He's very much misleading Alice, and if she heard what he was doing, she'd probably be extremely frustrated. So, my claim is this is what's happening in the debates about the tax question. Because to most people, the question isn't will taxes go up, it's whether I will pay more. For example, suppose right now you pay $1,000 a month on your health care. Let's say that includes your premiums, your out-of-pockets, prescription drugs, etc. $1,000 every month. Now, if Medicare for All came around and you only had to pay $700 a month, that would be a $300 savings, right? But because it's government run, that means $700 is a tax. So your taxes go up $700, but you're still actually saving $300. Now, when people hear taxes are going up, that usually means you have less money, right? So to frame it that way gives people the wrong impression. In reality, in this example, you would be saving $300. Now, assuming that the healthcare is just as good, well, in this case it will be better, and I'll maybe talk a little bit about that later. But for now, let's just assume they're the same. Then you would probably rather pay $700 in taxes than $1,000 to private companies. Now, if you were a libertarian or someone who just, hates the government, maybe you would be against this, but we're talking Democrats here, right? So phrasing it this way, saying taxes will go up, gives the wrong impression. It's intentionally misleading. And again, it was at all these debates. So it was NBC, CNN, ABC, New York Times did a thing with CNN. I think Washington Post got on one of these debates. So, and it's not the moderators that write the question, right? People go in and they think about these questions. So to say it's accidental is being incredibly naive. They are intentionally misleading about this. Now, in case you're still thinking, yeah, well, I don't think it's that big of a deal. Well, first of all, I'll give a little more context to this later on in the video, maybe in the closing. But just for some contrast, I want to approach this how I think might be a slightly more reasonable way. Maybe not the best, but a different way this topic, the idea of paying more in taxes, could be brought up that I think hits more to the heart of what's going on. And then you'll see why I'm frustrated, because you'll see how they're extremely different. So again, let's go to that example, $1,000 a month. So let's say you pay $1,000 per month, and again, that's your premium, out-of-pockets, etc. And let's suppose this is through your employer, this is for you and your family. Now, if your employer says, starting next year, we're switching to a new insurance company, and you're only going to pay $700 a month, it's all goes to a premium, but there are no out-of-pockets. So this covers all your doctor visits. There's no out-of-pockets again, so see the doctor as many times as you want. Any prescription drugs are covered. You'd be very happy with this, right? This would be a huge win. And I'm not just talking about the $300. I mean, that's also a plus. Most people like having an extra $300 a month, right? But it's more than that, because this $1,000 a month example I was using earlier is a soft number. What I mean by that is if you have a medical emergency and you have to, say, take an ambulance to the hospital, that number is going to be a lot more that month, right? Insurance companies suck at covering these types of things. If you have an emergency and go to an out-of-network hospital because, it's an emergency, I mean, you could get tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars in bills. I mean, you see this in the news all the time. And this $1,000, I believe the number was slightly over 1 million people that are estimated not to take prescription drugs because they can't afford it. So, in this case, you're paying $1,000 a month, but maybe you would have been paying $1,200 a month if you could afford it because there's a $200 a month prescription you need to take. Again, any emergency, if you get cancer, you don't have to worry about bankruptcy. This isn't a small thing. I think the number 87 million, as you'll see later, even Pete Buttigieg says that number, of people are underinsured. So, that's not quite, what are we, 300 million? So, I guess it is over a quarter of the population. So this is huge. A lot of people are foregoing medical help because they can't afford it. So again, I want you to acknowledge that this $1,000 to $700 example here is actually a lot bigger than $300. I mean, this would make families cry that they would be that happy. I mean, I'm hoping you're capable of empathizing and just imagining a family that's scraping by, what this would mean to them. So this is huge, right? And yet, well, first of all, right now I'm still assuming the $700 is a private insurance company, right? That's what I said in the example. Now imagine, or rather, what is the difference between this and the Medicare for All example I was using earlier with the same numbers? Nothing, right? Instead of paying $700 to a private company, you're paying $700 to the government. That's the only difference. You're still saving a few $100 compared to what you were paying, but you're also getting more health care. You don't worry about bankruptcy. You're not deciding whether you should take your medicine or see the doctor or put food on the table. In fact, I'd say the government case is actually better than if this were a private company. Because if it were the government, this would not be tied to your job. You wouldn't get this through your spouse. If you lost your job and couldn't afford it anymore, they'd still cover you. It'd be similar to public education, right? No one has to decide, do I put food on the table or pay to send my kid to school? It's covered. I mean, sure, it's paid one way or another, but it's covered. Imagine if everyone was forced to go to private schools. Do you think it would be cheaper? A lot of people would decide not to send their kids. So again, the way the media talked about this was just incredibly misleading. They lied about it, for one. But more than that, they belittled just how absolutely important this would be. Anyhow, sorry, kind of went a little long there. Let's move on to Joe Biden. Now, to give a little background first, I talked about this in my last video, but there was a study done by the Mercatus Group, which is a libertarian think tank backed by the Koch brothers. So this isn't a group that likes Sanders at all. And they did a study that showed Medicare for All would increase healthcare costs to $32 trillion over 10 years. And this is from 2022 to 2031. So assuming you got into office in 2021 and implemented it the next year. So this $32 trillion represents how much more the government would be paying by taking on, taking over for the private insurance and all that. Now, oddly enough, when people looked at the numbers they used and compared them to the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, they saw that that same chunk of health care, if things stayed as they were now, that would actually be $34 trillion. So this study, which again wasn't being nice with Bernie's numbers, they assumed large utilization rates, increases in utilization rates and things like that. They accidentally showed that Medicare for All would save money. $2 trillion. And again, it's probably more than that, but let's pretend that they were being nice with their numbers. To be fair, their numbers were much more realistic than Kenneth Thorpe's, who assumed horrible things, as I discussed in my last video. So I mentioned this study because I believe when Biden talks about the $30 trillion that Medicare for All would cost, I believe he's referencing this. And in fact, Michael Bennet, when he was in the debates, he mentioned $32 trillion himself. I'm going to use the $30 trillion number, not because it's smaller, but because I don't want to misquote Biden. So again, multiple times Biden said, Medicare for All is going to cost $30 trillion. I don't understand how Sanders is going to pay for this. And he would go on to say, my plan only costs $740 billion. Now you might notice that's, about 50 times smaller, 40 times smaller than 30 trillion. The reason why his number is so small is for two reasons. One, he's only talking about the cost for 1 year, but for Sanders he was talking about 10 years. Right? He's not doing an apples to apples comparison. Furthermore, that was only due to the changes he makes to Obamacare, like adding caps and such. So that doesn't include all the increase in costs over that same time period. It only includes the ones he's adding. So if you take how much it's already predicted to go up, the $34 trillion, and you add Biden's on top of that, $740 billion over 10 years, is $7.4 trillion. So his number comes out to roughly $41 trillion. So if Biden was being honest and did an apples-to-apples comparison, he's at about $40 trillion, whereas Bernie's at $30 trillion. So when he says, Bernie, I don't understand how you're going to afford $30 trillion. Mine only costs $40 trillion. It sounds, yeah. I mean, I think 40 is bigger than 30. So if Biden was honest and gave the right numbers and wasn't doing his and Bernie's in different contexts, you'd see his numbers were quite a bit more. And so, in other words, Biden was lying during the debates. And again, Sanders' numbers might even be less than 32 trillion. This was a libertarian group that made these estimates. And I do want to mention one other thing. The $32 trillion is what the government would pay extra because they're taking over private insurance. The $40 trillion here that, I'm estimating includes that same bank of healthcare, if you will, but it's some government and some private, right? Because Biden's still allowing for private. So it could be that his is actually less for the government in total. But remember, like that $1,000, $700 example I gave earlier. People, the money that they're putting into private insurance, not all of it, because they actually get to keep some, at least most people will. Rich people probably will pay more. But most people will keep a little. But generally speaking, the money they were putting into private insurance now goes to the government to pay for Medicare for all. So even if the government's spending a little more with Medicare for all, they're getting a lot more in revenue. And it's not really new revenue because the people were already paying this to private insurance. So the government, if they're paying an extra, say, $1 to $2 trillion a year to cover everyone, but they're getting $1 to $2 trillion a year extra in taxes, then there's no deficit there, right? There's no losses. And likewise, the people are paying less, so there's no losses there. So a lot of times they like to say the government's spending this. And I guess that's technically true, just like the tax thing. Sure, you're paying it to the government now, but that doesn't mean more money out of your pocket. And it also doesn't mean a deficit for the government. In fact, the government would probably save money under Medicare for all because healthcare would be less. The government right now still covers Medicare, still covers Medicaid. The over 20 million government employees in the U.S., they get private insurance. The government subsidizes it. They already spend, I think the number is close to 2/3 of healthcare is already covered by the government, one way or another. So anyhow, I just wanted to give a little context there. So Biden was lying, and even if you try to weasel out of this by saying, well, not all of Biden's is from the government, so it's less from the government, again, it doesn't matter. You're shifting money from private to government. So let's move on to Buttigieg. So there's kind of a few lies I'm going to say about him. It's, again, kind of being misleading, giving false impressions. So he kind of jumped on the whole Medicare for all tax thing. Right. In the debates he said, well, we heard it tonight, a yes or no question that didn't get a yes or no answer. Look, this is why people here in the Midwest are so frustrated with Washington in general and Capitol Hill in particular. So this was against Warren because she wouldn't answer yes or no about taxes going up. And as I said earlier, that's a trick question. So she knew she would be misrepresented just like Sanders was. So oftentimes, yes, it is annoying when politicians won't answer questions, but sometimes the questions are loaded, and so they're not always wrong. So Buttigieg jumped on this, not only in the debates, but I remember seeing him in an interview with one of the networks, between the debates and making a big stink about it. So, and look, I don't think he's anywhere near as intelligent as a lot of people seem to think, which is really frustrating. But he's clever enough that he knows what he's doing, so he's intentionally misleading and acting indignant. Warren won't answer a question that's clearly a lie. She's horrible. So I'm kind of grouping him with the moderators on this thing about him lying. He also said no plan has been laid out to explain how a multi-trillion-dollar hole in this Medicare for All plan that Senator Warren is putting forward is supposed to get filled in. So you may recall there were a few debates there where Warren was kind of near the top, so Bernie kind of got sidelined. And she did come out with her plan later. It wasn't at the time out, but Sanders had a plan for Medicare for All. And I talk about some of the costs in my last video, so again, there is no hole. The money you're paying for private insurance now goes to the government, so it's actually covered. So again, he's being misleading. He's jumping on that whole, explain how you're going to pay for this thing. So I'm calling him out much more than the other candidates because some of the others, like, Harris and even Klobuchar, when Harris was in, and Booker, when they were kind of brought into this thing, they kind of didn't attack Medicare for All so much. They kind of said, well, I maybe don't think it's the best, but I think my plan's better. But they weren't, being vicious like Buttigieg. So I'm definitely calling him out on that because he knows what he was doing. Furthermore, in the past, he said he did support Medicare for All. Now, you might be wondering why everyone's throwing around the name Medicare for All. If you look online, there are a lot of different plans, and a lot of them had similar names like Medicare Expansion for Everyone, or, I don't think that's one, but they had things like that. Medicare for All, though, was Bernie Sanders' plan, and it meant single payer. Now, Bernie Sanders was popular after 2016. Clinton kind of went away. This is before Pelosi became the House Speaker, and a lot of people, got behind him and said, yes, we'll support Medicare for All. And then I honestly don't know what happened, if, special interests got to them and they're corrupt, or maybe they thought public opinion changed, but they started wanting to back out of Medicare for All. So what they did is they kind of tried to redefine what Medicare for All meant. So later, Buttigieg is like, oh, I was always for Medicare for All, I just think it should be implemented differently. It's like, but Medicare for All meant a specific thing. So this also happened with Harris. I believe she used the Medicare for All name because she supported it originally. So everyone was given this impression that it had multiple definitions, but in reality, they were changing the definition so it didn't look like they were changing their view. And so Buttigieg did this. You can, I have some quotes here from Twitter where he says, I, Pete Buttigieg, politician, do henceforth and forthwith declare most affirmatively and indubitably into the ages that I do favor Medicare for All. He likes to talk big and sound super clever with his words, which is kind of why I don't like him. But he did say he supported Medicare for All. That was in 2018, and then he slowly kept changing his views. I know he got a lot of money from the healthcare industry. I don't want to say he's necessarily corrupt. Could just be other reasons, but so I'm calling him out on that too, because he's attacking Medicare for All really bad, even though he actually supported it. So he's being a bit dishonest there. He's trying to change the circumstances, act like, oh, I never really supported it. I supported a different version of it. So, again, I'm calling him out the most because he was extremely vicious. I mean, just a horrible human being. Anyhow, the other big thing I want to talk about that I believe he's being misleading on is this idea of a choice. Now, a couple years ago, Ted Cruz and Bernie Sanders were on CNN doing a town hall talking about the Affordable Care Act. Bernie Sanders was actually defending it. I know people like to make it sound like he was going to scrap it. Anyhow, I don't want to get into that. I'll talk a little bit about that in my other video. But he was defending it, and one of the things Pete Buttigieg kind of made me think of what Ted Cruz said. So I'm going to read you two quotes. One is from Cruz and one is from Buttigieg. And let's see if you can figure out who said which. So the first quote is, "The problem, Senator Sanders, with Medicare for All is that it doesn't trust the American people. I trust you to choose what makes the most sense for you. I trust the American people to make the right choice for them. Why don't you? And then the other one. Healthcare is personal in a way that is different from most other political issues. Healthcare affects our families. It can quite literally be whether we live or die. And this is an issue where Bernie Sanders and I have fundamentally different approaches. I think healthcare works better when you're in charge of your family's healthcare decisions. So there's this idea of choice. And in particular, I'm not going to tell you who said which, by the way. I think it's not too hard to figure out just by the way they talk, but if you can't figure it out, it's too bad. But Buttigieg likes to put forward this idea of choice, right? You can choose the public government healthcare, or you can choose private insurance. I'm going to trust you. And that is really a Republican talking point. I'm going to read this quote from Bill de Blasio during one of the debates, because I thought it was a really good quote, and I appreciated him saying it. It was nice to hear at least one more reasonable person on the stage. I don't know much about de Blasio in general, but at least on this, I appreciated it. So this is what he said. I don't know what the vice president and the senator are talking about. The folks I talk to about health insurance say that their health insurance isn't working for them. There's tens of millions of Americans who don't even have health insurance. Tens of millions more who have health insurance they can barely make work because of the copays, the deductibles, the premiums, the out-of-pocket expenses. There's this mythology that somehow all of these folks are in love with their insurance in America. What I hear from union members and from hard-working middle-class people is they wish they had better insurance, and they're angry at private insurance companies that skim all the profits off the top and make it impossible for everyday people to get coverage like mental care, dental care, the things that would be full coverage for all Americans. So I appreciated that, because they kept throwing around this idea, people want to keep their insurance. Now there is some truth to that, but it's a little misleading. First off, what people really want is good, affordable health care. Hopefully we can agree on that. That's the number one thing. Now some people want to keep their private insurance for a couple of reasons. They haven't had any issues. These are usually healthier people. Maybe they haven't paid much because their employer pays a lot of it, which again, that would still hold with Medicare for All. But also there's some lies. I know you could hear a talk that Biden gave that was talking about how Medicare for All would disrupt Medicare as it is now. And a lot of people also like to say, your hospital waiting times would be longer, and basically that the quality would drop, which is just crap. So I think some people want to keep it for not good reasons. But I think more than anything, it's not private insurance or government insurance. They just want good insurance, and for it to be affordable. So Buttigieg keeps trying to drive it like, he's giving people the choice. He doesn't want to, take that away. But this is a little misleading, because it's called Medicare for All who want it, right? It's kind of a play on Medicare for All. The problem is his public option is nothing like what Medicare for All would be. So let's consider how this public option could be implemented. Now let's suppose it's really good, i.e. it's like Medicare for All. You pay less than you're paying now, and that covers everything. No co-pays, nothing like that. No bankruptcy or anything. This would be great, but where does that money come from? Because for Medicare for All, one of the huge pluses about it is the administrative savings. And Buttigieg actually gives a number on that later, which I'll get to. But for Medicare for All, we'd expect to save around 20% of total health care costs. If you watched my last video, you saw that we paid in 2015, I think it was, $10,000 per person for health care. $3,000 of that was administrative costs. And Canada only pays $750 per person. So we could potentially get it saving more than 20% of what we pay now, but say 20%. Again, that's all the costs, not save 20% on administration only. 20% of everything on healthcare. So with all that extra money, that's how you're able to cover everyone cheaply, right? And make it a good health insurance plan. Not only that, you don't have all these various groups, trying to negotiate prices. The government has a lot more negotiating power, obviously, because they're the only ones, and that would help drive down costs. And again, we see this in other civilized nations. They pay way less than we do. Canada pays half. There are some countries that do have private insurance, that's true, but in those cases, they're under the thumb of the government. So even in those cases, it's very similar to Medicare for All. So the public option would not have those huge savings, which means if you try to make the public option really good and affordable to the user, it would cost a lot of money for the government. And that's a little funny because Pete Buttigieg, kept saying, taxes are going to go up. How do you explain that, Warren? How do you explain that, Sanders? But if he implements this, his would be worse. I mean, taxes might be a little less, but the government wouldn't be getting more in, so they would actually cause a bigger deficit. Now, a way around that is option number 2. You could have a public option, but just make it horrible, similar to private insurance now, large deductibles, etc. Also, not cover everyone, right? So there'd still be uninsured and underinsured. Medicare for All covers everybody. So he gives this impression that he's giving you a choice. Hey, you can have what Sanders is offering, or you can keep what you have. But he cannot offer what Sanders is offering. All he could offer is a bad government plan. So it's a false choice. He's misleading. And again, he's smart enough to know better. So I'd say he's also lying about this. Now, I did go to his website. There's a 10-page white paper, and I tried to look at it just to see what his cost estimates are, because, right, he's calling out the others on their costs. And he says his will only cost $1.5 trillion over 10 years. Now, I tried to dig into this to see where that number comes from. All I see is how he'd pay for it, but not where the number comes from. Now, remember, Biden was $740 billion a year, which is $7.4 trillion over 10 years. So even Biden's number is 5 times larger than Buttigieg's. And if you look at Biden's plan and Buttigieg's plan, they're extremely similar. So this idea that his won't cost but $1.5 trillion it's a lie. I mean, depending on how he defines it, right? There's no context to that number, so I guess I can't say it's technically a lie because it's too vague. But it's a lie. It's misleading. There's no way it's that cheap. I mean, his healthcare plan sucks. So, yeah. But even he adds things like capping premiums. He doesn't cap costs, but except for seniors. Putting limits on surprise bills, out-of-network stuff, etc. There is, I believe, a little on prescription drugs. So there's a little in his plan that would cost money. Similar to Biden's plan, but again, he's using a much smaller number than Biden, so he's not being honest about this at all. And he makes it sound, again, like, people have a choice and this is good. And he mentions even in his paper that there's 87 million people that are underinsured, but then he doesn't really say what he'd do about that. Just, things will be better. But it says nothing about whether everybody would get insurance. Now, there is a little bit, related like Medicaid. Again, the poorest would get something at least. But it doesn't sound like everyone would. So that you'd still have uninsured. And again, the underinsured seems to not have been really talked about. Some low-income people would be auto-enrolled. Similar to Biden, they said the states that, kind of didn't take advantage of Obamacare. So there were people that should have been able to be on Medicaid. They'd cover that. But generally speaking, not everyone gets auto-enrolled. I don't believe. And he says another thing, that he'd reduce administrative costs by harmonizing standards for transactions, which, is fine, but it only saves $10 billion. And right now, I think we're close to $4 trillion that we spend a year on healthcare. And remember, with Medicare for All, we could save about 20%. So that would be, if I can do math, 800 billion. So you compare that to 10 billion. Basically, as I was saying, he doesn't get that savings from administrative costs. Now look, I want to say the idea of throwing in a public option and slowly trying to, scoot us into a government-only plan by itself isn't a horrible idea, and I don't think it's dishonest. It's just he's being extremely dishonest about it, and his attacks on Medicare for All are lies. Also, I don't know, people think the health insurance agency is not aware of what would happen in this case, that they'd be kind of pushed out. So it's not quite as clever as people think, at least I don't believe so. Maybe there's something I'm missing. Also, we'll just mention, in Buttigieg's white paper, he gets a number of references to the Center for American Progress. Their current president was part of the Clinton campaign and absolutely hates Bernie Sanders. This is pretty well known. And they're kind of your big neoliberal group. Now, I'm a little wary of them. They're not necessarily bad on all fronts. But then there's another group called Third Way, and they seem to be more of a centrist organization, and apparently they've gotten lots of money from big pharma. So I didn't dig into the details of this, and I probably should have. I don't want to insinuate too much here, but just it certainly caught my attention that maybe some of his talking points aren't the best and don't come from the best sources. So again, Buttigieg kind of lied, similar to the moderators, jumping on the whole, taxes going up. But he took it even further, being extremely vicious and acting like he didn't used to support Medicare for All. Apparently he changed his mind because maybe it's not popular anymore, or maybe he got corrupt, I don't know. Also, this idea of a choice is false. He makes it sound like you could actually have a good choice, but his only options are crap government insurance or crap private insurance. So that is misleading. And again, looking at some of his numbers, this 1.5 trillion is it's an outright lie. I mean, it's insane. He might as well just said it was free. So he's lied on a number of things, And as I said before, I'm not going to play around with semantics. You can say it lie, you can say he was being dishonest, deceiving, whatever. He wasn't being very good on this topic, I'll say that. Now, just some closing remarks. Some people like to be like, oh, you're overreacting, but I'm really not. As I was saying before with like that example with, if a family scraping by was able to not only save a few $100, but not worry about bankruptcy or deciding whether to take medication. I mean, tens of thousands of people are believed to die from not being insured. And healthcare is the number one reason for bankruptcy. I mean, having something like Medicare for All would take such a load off so many people's shoulders. I mean, they would weep tears of joy. This is a huge thing. I mean, if you're going to, let's say, attack Republicans for not caring about global warming or something, or not looking at the facts or not caring about them, well, look, in this case, the facts are Medicare for All makes the most sense. And again, people like to talk about pragmatism. Well, I talk a bit about that in my last video, so if you haven't watched that, I hope you will. I don't want to go into too much here. But this is a bit self-fulfilling. I mean, right now, Sanders has a lot of momentum, so we're very well situated, more so than we've been in a long time. So now is the best time to start supporting this type of stuff. But if more people supported it and called out, say, the media for their lies, then, maybe this stuff would start to change. And so long as people believe it's not pragmatic, they're being extremely self-defeating. And, that type of behavior with the lies of the media and these politicians, again, they're very literally causing people to die. So, this is a big deal. and people should be upset, and they should care. Anyhow, sorry this went on a little long, but I thank you for watching the video. Hope maybe you see things a little differently. And yeah, I'll stop now.